taxes, and I don't like property taxes either, and I don't think they're fair. But I wouldn't be in favor of revising the tax system in New Hampshire without revising the political system, because in addition to being a professor of economics at UNH, my hobby is local politics, and I'm chair of the Durham Town Council, and I've been on the council for 7 years. And it's scary sometimes to see how decisions are made with the taxpayers' money. So before I would feel comfortable with talking about different taxes or new taxes, I would need to talk about the system that takes in those taxes and the system that spends those taxes. But I do want to add, I guess, to the anti-property tax rhetoric by talking about a real example, because unfortunately the property taxes lead to perversions in the economy that you then see your political system sort of doing backflips to try and solve, and yet they're problems that you really can't solve. And let me give you an example. At a local municipal level, when I think about property taxes, it's always about kids in the schools, right? Because it's very expensive to educate those kids. In Durham, 70% of our property taxes go to support kids in the school. And it's unfortunate to me sometimes that we have a tax system that sort of pits us against our children, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me and doesn't make me feel very good. But because it's so expensive to educate kids, then municipalities try to do whatever they can to discourage the construction of family housing or multi-unit housing, which may bring a lot of children in the town, because the reality is that the property taxes that single-family home is going to pay is not going to offset the cost of providing municipal services plus the cost of educating those children. And so what you tend to see happen then on the local level is either through local zoning ordinances or in other ways, you sort of discourage the use of land because you're frightened that somebody will use it in a way that will bring children into your community. The net effect is to substantially increase land costs. That's why housing is so expensive in the state of New Hampshire. I mean, we make it expensive because we don't want any children living in our community. And I don't mean to make it sound that we hate children in this state, but oftentimes our decisions seem to be motivated based on that. And the unintended consequence then of making land expensive and hence housing expensive is that it's difficult for young families or young people, even before they start a family, to be able to live and work in this state. You know, entry-level jobs don't pay a lot of money, and if your housing costs are extraordinarily high and you're a young person, you might say, hey, why don't I go someplace else? And the challenge that this creates for the state of New Hampshire, of course, is that we're getting to be a very old state, that our population is aging, and we're not sort of revitalizing the state by keeping those few children that we have who grow up to young adults into the state. And so it's very difficult for somebody who's starting off in a career to live here and have a nice quality of life. So while, you know, I'm at the later part of my career, I guess, I've got a very nice life. You know, I worked very hard to create it. But I'm not sure if I was, 30 years old again, or 28 or 25 years old, that I could make it in this state, and I'd probably think of going someplace else. And so it's nice to talk about the New Hampshire advantage, whatever that is, or people who like to talk about low taxes, but the taxes aren't low for those people who represent the future of the state of New Hampshire. And as the result, as we try and hold on to this tax system that works for some but doesn't work for most of us, I like to think, the state legislature then is forced to create sort of meaningless legislation. So, for example, the legislature has recently passed a bill for workforce housing, where municipalities are now required to create their fair share, whatever that means, of workforce housing in order to try and increase the supply of housing to reduce the price so that young people can get a start here and perhaps begin that nice life. But the problem is that the legislature finds itself in a difficult position of mandating something that they know that local municipalities can't really afford, and will do whatever it takes to, in some sense, undermine that legislation to the point of potentially voting these legislators out. And so we get laws that have noble intentions but really have no teeth, and as a result we talk about workforce housing or affordable housing, we talk about tax burden, and yet we create these meaningless laws that in the end do absolutely nothing. And so the problem persists. And as a result, what's going to happen? We're just going to wind up having a state populated by elderly people who are going to drive up the costs for municipalities, because it's not kids in the school anymore, it's ambulance services, it's medical services. You know, we like to think that elderly people are cheap, but they're not cheap. When they call the fire department, you know, on a regular basis, and in Durham they want services, rightly so. I don't have any kids in the school. Why don't I have a nice library? Why don't I have this? Why don't I have that? And so we're losing our engine for economic growth, and yet our costs are going to continue to escalate, which just means higher property tax burden on everybody. And until, in my view, we reform the political system, I'm not sure we can actually have a conversation of how we can turn our economic ship in the right direction. So anyways, those are my thoughts.
Fantastic. Do you want to say what you mean by reform the political system?
Oh, I'm worried I'm going to get myself into trouble. You want, yeah.
Well, just encapsulate for us, staying on topic here with taxes. I mean, what are some of the decision mechanisms that you think are problematic?
Well, I think the biggest problem in the state of New Hampshire is it's run by a bunch of amateurs. You know, in other states, you know, you talk about professional politicians, but there's an advantage to people who go to work every day, that they take a salary and they get trained and they actually know what they're doing. So we like to talk about, the House is the third largest legislative body, but in my opinion, the House represents no one. You know, what's that saying? You know, if you're everything to everybody, then you're nothing to nobody. Oh, that's probably bad. But you know, for us, we have 6 state reps between 3 towns, and they don't really represent any of the towns. And if Durham has an interest, they're afraid to alienate their constituents in Lee and Madbury, and so they don't really represent us, and they don't really do much for us. And they seem to spend a good deal of their time talking about relatively insignificant things rather than the things that are meaningful and important to us. So my first step in reforming the political system would be to shrink the legislative body, to get it down to a true representative democracy where you can hold people accountable, because that is their job. Their job is to represent you. Their job is not, well, nobody else could do it and there was an empty spot, so I stuck my name in because, you know, somebody had to do it. And I guess that would be the first step.
Well, that should get the conversation started.